Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come and eat. Listen diligently to me, and eat what is good, and let your soul delight itself.
Okay. So I wanted to touch a little bit on the topic of head coverings, because this is very often misunderstood, even in folks that consider themselves Messianic, Hebrew roots folks, because I've heard some big name teachers teach against head coverings.
Head coverings for men or?
For men, okay? Men wearing a head covering. So I thought it's important that I bring out what Scripture says about this, and then you guys can see that what y'all had intended for us, okay? I want to bring in the person of the priest when we talk about head coverings. Exodus 29, 4 through 9, talks about Aaron and his sons. So remember, in Exodus, Moshe is receiving the pattern and the plan, just how he wants them to set it out. And he says, when you do this, I want you to take and anoint Aaron and his sons, anoint them by pouring it on their head. Then you're to bring them and you're to dress them up. And he tells them, because they were to be teaching lessons for the people. And he says, you're going to have more tunics, and they're to have their heads covered. Put headbands on them, he says, and tie sashes on them. So that's where it's mentioned in the pattern. Then we realize it was brought into reality there in Leviticus 8:13. Then they bring the sons forward, they put their tunics on them, they tied sashes about them, and they covered their heads. They put headbands on them, just as Yah had commanded Moshe. Ezekiel 44, and this is future, he says the priests, who are the Levites, descendants of Zadok, who faithfully carried out their duties, they're going to and they were the faithful priesthood when all of Israel went astray. He says they're going to come near and minister before me. They're going to stand before me and offer sacrifices of fat and blood, declares Sovereign Yahweh. They alone are going to enter my sanctuary, and they alone are going to come near to my table to minister before me. When they enter the gates of the inner court, they're to wear their linen clothes. Now, so Ezekiel 44 is a really good one. If he's calling you up to that higher place on things to think about as a priesthood. When you're serving and working before him, you're not to wear wool. You're to wear your linens. Verse 18, he says they're to wear linen turbans on their heads. They're to have their heads covered, and linen undergarments around their waists. They must not wear anything that makes them perspire. But when they go out into the outer court where the people are, they're to take off those clothes that they've been ministering in, and they're to leave them in the sacred rooms and put on other clothes so that they don't consecrate the people by means of their garments. There's both sides of this, I think, get it wrong. Orthodox Judaism teaches that a man can't walk 10 steps without having a kippah on his head. The Hebrew word kippah is like, it's a covering, just like Yom Kippur is the day of covering or day of atonement. So it speaks about a covering, just like the covering on the ark, where the cherubim were on the Ark of the Covenant there, the Kepharet. I think, because you notice these set-apart garments, they weren't to wear out in non-set-apart places, in areas that weren't special to Yah. So in an area, though, where you are functioning and working as a priest, you are to have your head covered. So it's not for every place, because you notice these guys took these clothes off when they went out into the outer courts. But while they were in the place where Yah had them be serving him, that's when they had to have their head covered. So I'll slide down a bit. It says they weren't to shave their heads, but they also weren't to let their hair grow long. They were to keep the hair of their heads trimmed and neat looking. Because you weren't to look like mad, crazy people. You're to look neat and clean, because you're representing, the priest is to represent Yeshua to the people, just like the lamb. You could eat lambs, maybe that something happened to him and maybe he broke his leg or something, and you could still eat him. He's a clean animal, but you couldn't bring him as an offering, because that is a picture of who Yeshua is. So that everything there had to be perfect. Just like priests that had something wrong with him, he couldn't serve. It's not that Yah didn't love him any less, but he's representing a perfect picture, so that you wouldn't want that perfect picture to be somebody that limped or something. It's supposed to be the perfect example. Okay, and this is how we operate today. You notice in verse 23 that teach the people the difference between the holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between unclean and clean. That, I think, is a duty that we can still have today, to show the difference and be a light. Because remember, a light shines on things to show a difference between things, show what's right and wrong. These scriptures apply to us as his servants because, remember, you, Israel, are a people, a nation of kings and priests. Revelation 5:10, he says that we are made. You've made us to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and we're going to reign on the earth. 1 Peter says, 2, 9 and 10, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to Elohim, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. That's taken, the idea is taken from Torah. In Exodus 19, 5 and 6, he says, although the whole earth is mine, you're going to be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So if we're a kingdom of priests, we have to dress like priests and look like priests. Men, I believe, that, if you're up functioning as a priest and distinguishing, helping to teach and distinguish between right and wrong and being a teacher, it's a good idea to show, it's a symbol to show that I'm under his covering and that I'm set apart to him. It's a symbol of set apartness. I tied this in because in our scripture reading in 2 Samuel there, we read that Zadok and Abiathar took the ark back to Jerusalem and were staying there. Now David, though, he continued on up to the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. Now he was going up to a place where there was an altar to Yahweh there. And as he was going up to meet with Yahweh, do you see what he did? He says his head was covered and he was barefoot. And all the people with him covered their heads too and were weeping as they went up. So I'll submit to you that this is a state that we're to be in. Because remember, the priests didn't wear shoes when they served. They were barefoot while they served. So, and every time when they're in Yah's presence, what did he tell Moshe? He said, Moshe, you take those shoes off. You're standing on set apart ground. So Moshe had to kick his shoes off to serve before him. And I know there are teachers in the Messianic community that will minister barefoot and teach barefoot. Today I have my shoes on, but I think there's a pattern there that's the state of set apartness where he wants us. As we to finish where they were headed, so when David arrived at the summit of that hill, it's the Mount of Olives there, where the people used to worship God. Then the Hushai met him there and tore his robe and put dust on his head. But David was going up to worship Elohim, and so he covered his head, and all the people with him covered their heads. Isaiah 61:10 talks about putting on garments of salvation and a robe of righteousness. And we see as a bridegroom adorns his head like a priest, and a bride adorns herself with jewels. Our bridegroom will have his head covered, but it's the marriage garments too, is to have your head covered. Zechariah 3:5, he talks about the high priest there, and he's going to put a clean turban on his head, clothe him. Now I want to touch on, this is really important because the one we come against is, I said, what about 1 Corinthians chapter 11? That's the one that's used by a lot of churches to say why we don't need to have our heads covered. So I think it's important to take a look at that. So I quote here now, in verse 3 it says, now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And Even the NIV says, let's see, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. So they'll take that verse 4 and try to do away with a whole bunch of what the rest of Scripture says. And it says, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off, for it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or shaved off. She should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. So if you read it like that in the English, I can see why people might say a man ought not cover his head. Now, in alternate rendering, if you in my NIV down in the bottom, they said now another way of putting those verses is that every man who prays or prophesies with long hair dishonors his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with no covering, it's implied, of hair on her head, dishonors her head, because she's just like one of the shorn women. If a woman has no covering, let her be for now with short hair, since it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair shorn or shaved. She should grow it again. And a man ought not to have long hair. And I think that's the true rendering a truer rendering of the Greek there, is what they put as the alternate rendering there. Because it's clear if we're reading it in context, because later in that same chapter, verse 14, it says, doesn't even nature teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him? So read in context, the second rendering makes better sense to us, that they're talking about men having long hair instead of walking around with a covering, because it says a disgrace to him. But if a woman has long hair, it's her glory. For long hair is given to her as a covering. So we're talking about long hair here, not about whether or not you're supposed to have some kind of covering on top of your head made of some other material. In context here, and Nathan and I were discussing this before earlier today, and he was bringing up the practices of Corinth. It was a very pagan city, and there were still lots of pagan idolatry and pagan temples. And it was common in a pagan temple that when people went up, that they had prostitutes there as part of their worship, and both male and female prostitutes. And many of the male prostitutes would disguise themselves as women. So if you've got a man with really long hair and he's making himself up to sleep with other men and everything, like a transvestite, there were a lot of people in the city that were doing this. They were men that had kept really long hair to try to look like women as part of their practices in their religion. So Paul had to address this in the Corinth community there, because he was trying to tell them that it's not right. So hopefully you can see that in context there, that especially I believe verse 14 sets the context, because it's truly talking about a man who has long hair, and the woman with long hair, it's given to her as her covering. That if you read it in that context, it makes perfect sense. I go into a little bit about the special case of the Nazarite, because you may say, well, what about when the Scripture talks about that it's okay to have long hair? And that sort of ties in a little bit about why we have our head covered, because Numbers 6:5-8 talks about taking a Nazarite vow, that during the entire period of the vow of separation, no razor is to be used on a person's head. That you're holy, you're set apart during your period of separation to Yah until it's over. And during that entire time, you let the hair of your head grow long. This was the way that any normal person could approach a level of sanctification like the high priest. That you became so set apart to Yah that you couldn't go near a dead person, you couldn't have any wine ever. In fact, not even a grape. They couldn't eat a raisin or a grape or anything. Because remember, when a priest serves, he wasn't allowed to. I think we read that earlier in this context, or it was in the Ezekiel 44 one. It says during the whole time of their service, they weren't allowed to drink any wine, because that could corrupt your judgment. And so, I take that when I'm...
The Nadab and Abihu thing.
Right, it's the whole Nadab and Abihu thing, because they couldn't distinguish between set apart and they burned incense that wasn't acceptable before him.
And the very next scripture after that event, where Yehovah destroyed Nadab and Abihu, is the prohibition against ministering under the influence of alcohol.
Exactly. So this is how any one of us could approach that set apartness, is we could take a vow before him, an Nazarite vow, and it raises us to that same level as like the high priest. So it's not that he's showing favoritism. He allows any one of us, man or woman, because it says a woman can take a Nazarite vow too. And throughout the period of your separation, you couldn't go near a dead body, even if your father, mother, brother, or sister dies. You must not make yourself ceremonially unclean on the account of them. It says, because the symbol of his separation to his God is on his head. So there, it's funny, because there, the long hair is a symbol of your separation to Yah. So with this, when I'm wearing a head covering, I don't wear it all the time, because I think Judah has it wrong that you're supposed to wear it as soon as you get up out of bed in the morning. You put it on your head, and and there are Orthodox Jews that's how they live their life.
Just for the record here, that is a very, very late tradition from the Middle Ages. This idea of wearing a kippah and you can go. In my library, I have the Book of Jewish Why, volumes 1 and 2, and you go to other Jewish sources, and they will tell you, look, it wasn't that way. We added that tradition in the 1500s.
Right.
So then there's many Messianic type people that want to follow the Jews, and they feel that, well, we're going to be like them and wear a kippah. Well, that's fine. You're just following non-biblical traditions. If you want to do that, that's fine. But that's not biblical. What Dr. Joe is saying is biblical. But the idea of wearing a kippah, that's not why some of us are wearing coverings. We're doing it for the reasons that he gave, not because we're trying to out-Jew the Jews or be Jewish or be rabbinical. That, for me, that has nothing. In fact, I won't wear a kippah. I'll wear another kind of a hat, but I won't wear a kippah just because I don't want to identify with that unbiblical. Quite frankly, it's an unbiblical tradition. And so that's why we do it. Just since we're making a video on this, it's important that we tag all the bases.
That's right. The pendulum can't be too far the one way and say that you always have to wear it, but that's what that one teacher taught about. Is he said, look, it's just their tradition, and there's nothing to it and everything. And so he taught against anybody ever wearing one. And so I think that's too far. That we should to say that we never should wear one. I think there's a point and a place for it. There is a place, and there is a scriptural place for it, that when you're serving him, and it's just like for the Nazarite, it's a symbol of our separation to God is on our head, like there in Numbers 6, 5 through 8. This is a symbol that I'm separate to him, and I'm not saying I'm any better than anybody else. It's just I'm a man under authority. I'm under his authority, and I'm praying, hoping that my words are his words, and that he gives me the right words to share with all of you. So I'm just showing that I'm under authority now. So that's why I feel that I should wear one when I'm teaching, and there's biblical reason to stand on that, and especially, and for any of you too, that when you're here to in a set-apart place, which this assembly is, that it's okay to wear one here now, because we're all priests in training. We're all trying to learn, because he wants us to be a nation of priests and kings. So how are you going to learn how to be a priest unless we come and we start learning these things? I like what my brother Nathan did. One of the things a king had to do was to write his own copy of Torah. And I haven't gotten to do that yet, but I think but it's a good. At least you started it, and so I think that's a really nice thing to do. So if you want to learn it, every aspect of doing it, walking it out, is super important. But one of the things, if you write it, imagine how well you're going to start to get it in your brain if you not only read it, but you wrote it, and you're walking it out.
Scribed for the legal experts of their day,
because they got to write it over and over and over and over.
They were the lawyers.
Yep, exactly. So anyway, just to add balance to this teaching, that it is appropriate at times to wear a covering on your head. It's a symbol of your separation, and it's a symbol that you're under authority. And so, you know, I guess I ended here with this, the example of Samuel. Remember, Hannah promised when she gave her son to Yah, she said that no razor would ever be used on his head, that even from his birth he was set apart to Yah. And I think, you know, in some of our pictures of Yeshua, they picture Yeshua with long hair. And he may have been set apart from his birth just like that. Nobody's sure because it doesn't specifically record that. But although, no, he drank wine. Mm-hmm. So, right, he could not have, maybe at some certain point in his life he may have taken a Nazarite vow, but you would have be done with your vow then. So, before I end on the topic of head covering,
I'd like to, just before we get in, I'd like to add, since we haven't done a video on head coverings before, and I want to put this out there because actually, you know, we get calls from people who want to come and visit this congregation. And one of the I just got a lady just called the other day, and one of the first questions, one of the main questions they ask us is they want to know what is our dress code, and should a woman wear a covering, a head covering? Because evidently these people have been in places where there's like really strict rules. There are congregations, I don't know if they're still around, but I've known of congregations in this metropolitan area. I'm talking about, and I'm not talking about rabbinic Jewish synagogues. I'm talking about Messianic, where you don't walk in unless you put on they've got racks of kippas or talits. And, you know, I have a talit. Joe's wearing his, but I have a mini talit. You can't see it on the camera here. But see, I have my fringes. They're right here. But you don't walk in without putting a head covering on. Well, again, they're just following rabbinic tradition. But that's a question that people have. And so they ask us what our dress code is. And I tell them it's nice, casual, and modest. I don't want to see a woman. Because
modesty is important.
You know, whatever. And I don't want, you know, so modesty. We don't want to see all your body curves and all that. This isn't a place of lust and that kind of thing. We don't want to engender. But then they ask, you know, so we say with regard to women, and I tell them exactly what Paul says here. Paul says that every woman, this is 1 Corinthians 11, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Now, I'm going to take a little different approach, and I know Dr. Joe was quoting the NIV, but I don't necessarily agree with that interpretation, and I need to say that because
that's fine.
Because we need to. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I want to cover several points on this video because otherwise you'll get the cards and letters and this and that. I've also looked at the Greek. And the Greek for covered, I don't think it's referring to the hair. Because otherwise, like we said, John the Baptist was a Nazarite. And so was Samson, and so was Samuel. And so this was obviously an exception. Now, it could have been because Paul does make the statement about it's a shame for a man to have long hair. So there is that passage there. So Paul might have been talking about that, and he probably was including that. But we also have to include the fact that these male prostitutes, remember, in these pagan temples, sexual activity was a way of worshiping. It was a cultic practice for worshiping the gods and goddesses of fertility. That's why they did it. Okay? And that's just and they still do it. I mean, the Druids and the witchcraft, it's all the Baal worship, it was all part of it. Nimrod and Semiramis, or Semiramis, depending on how you want to pronounce it, you know, it was all part of it. And so, this idea of covered, one of the meanings of it means veiled. Go look it up, it means veiled. Women were to wear a covering when they prophesied and they prayed. Now, here it says because of the angels. We don't know what that means. I've heard different people teach about that, and I don't know what that means. Okay? I mean, we can speculate, but this is the only place in the Bible where it talks about this. But a woman, so we follow that for a woman. She doesn't have to wear a head covering when she's in our congregation, but if she's going to get up and pray, or she's going to prophesy, or she's going to speak publicly, she needs to put a head covering on. So like my wife just puts one on, and she has it on all the time. Some women will wear a veil or a scarf, and then they'll have it around their shoulders, and then if they're going to get up and pray, they'll just flip it up over. Or like you got a hoodie there you go, that works too. And so that's what we teach here. And we also, you notice that Poe, when she's up here, and Anna, when they're ministering the music, they've got a head covering on, and that's proper. But a man, I think it's not just talking about hair, because otherwise there's people that are bald who don't have much up top, and so and I think it's men aren't to wear a veil. And normally, unless it's a special circumstances, a man is not to have long hair, because he's not to look like a woman. In the Torah, they wore men were not to wear clothing that pertain to a woman, and vice versa. And that's going to be a cultural thing. It's going to vary from cultures to cultures. I mean, back in biblical times, men wear robes, which we would look at now as a long dress. In Scotland, they wear kilts and these kinds of things. So it's going to be a cultural thing. But there needs to be a difference in the clothing that women wear, and the same way they do their hair. And because it's a gender identity thing. And now in our day and age, you got cross-dressing, and you got some places where men can go into women's restrooms and vice versa. Everything's all screwed up. When you throw out the Bible, you throw everything up. And now we're getting to the point where you may as well just be like the Corinthians and just have sex and go here and go there and dress however you want, and just anything goes. In our society, it's becoming like that. If it feels good, do it. And that's the satanic mantra. Do what thou wilt. But there are standards in the Bible. So certainly it is not appropriate under normal circumstances for men to have long hair unless they are a Nazarite. And I think Paul he covers that, tags that base. And also, men don't want to be wearing veils like a woman wore, because that was a thing that pertained to a woman. But there's no prohibition about a hat, as Dr. Joe so articulately pointed out. So.
Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon his name. He's near, he's near, he's near. Yeshu Hashem Behir Matzov Kerahu Yoto Karov Karov Yasov Rasha Darko Yishavim Machshevotav Yashovel Ad Hashem Yeshu Hashem Behim Matzov Kerahu Yota Karo Yeshua Hashem behi matzot